Back in 2006, I made the decision to move out of the Inland Empire, thinking it was the right move at the time. Well, let me tell you, that was a mistake. I ended up in Adelanto, out in the high desert, and although I found a decent Spanish-style home built in '93, that house brought nothing but trouble. It didn't take long before things got weird. My black and white cat, Sylvia, started acting strange almost immediately. She would sit at the hallway entry, staring, like dead staring, down the hall as if there was something or someone standing there. Every time I'd check, there was nothing. It gave me the creeps. At night, Sylvia would claw at my bedroom door, desperate to get in. She'd meow, sweep her paw under the door, and scratch like her life depended on it. It was unlike anything she'd done before. I always let her in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to escape from something. Then came the smell. One day, my son Glenn asked if I had left any meat out to spoil. I was confused, but then I smelled it too, this awful stench of rotten, bloody meat. It was so strong, but there was no source. No spoiled meat, no trash left out, nothing. It would linger for a few days, then disappear, only to return a month or so later. Just thinking about it still makes me feel sick. Our dog? Same thing. He would sit out in the yard, staring up at the roof and barking like he was seeing something we couldn't. Then, late at night, we'd hear strange sounds, like the shuffling of feet on the carpet in my bedroom, or worse, the doorknob rattling on its own. It didn't stop there. Things in the house would move by themselves, too. Hairbrushes, toothpaste, small items on the vanity. They would slide across the surface as if some invisible hand was pushing them. But the scariest moment came one evening when my daughter, Lisa, was outside jumping rope under the porch light. Suddenly, she let out a scream so blood-curdling that my heart nearly stopped. I rushed outside, and there she was, running towards me, terrified and out of breath. When I asked her what happened, she said she saw something. Something big, hairy, and hunched over, staring down at her from the roof. Its eyes were glowing, and it was just standing there, watching her. That house? It was a year of non-stop, unexplainable events. It felt like someone or something was always right behind me when I walked down that hallway, and Sylvia never stopped obsessing over it. Every time I walked past, the back of my neck would prickle with the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. The moment I had the chance, I got out of there, moved back to San Bernardino without a second thought. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't something I wanted to stick around and figure out. Some places are just wrong, and that house in Adelanto? It was one of them.
Back in October 2005, when I was just 15, my family and I were living in a cramped apartment above an old Esso gas station in Bostrak, Norway. The place wasn't much, just a few rooms that always seemed to echo with the low hum of cars pulling in and out, their headlights cutting through the thick early evening fog. The cold that year bit sharper than usual, and our windows, frost-kissed and rattling, always felt like a thin veil between us and the vast, icy darkness outside. It was one of those places where you could feel the history seeping through the walls, but not the good kind, the kind that made the air heavy, like you weren't ever quite alone. It was late October, the 30th to be exact. That night I had a dream so vivid that even after all these years, I can still recall every unsettling detail. In the dream, I was standing in our small, dimly lit living room. Everything was exactly as it was in real life, down to the worn brown sofa and the soft glow of the floor lamp casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. But then, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. A little boy standing in the middle of the room, sobbing. He was no older than 8 or 9, his blonde hair messy and his face streaked with tears. He was dressed in a faded striped t-shirt, and on the center of his chest was a silver star, almost glowing in the dim light. He spoke to me, his voice trembling and desperate, in Swedish. I'm Norwegian, but I understood him perfectly. The words "bus accident" escaped his lips over and over again, like a broken record. His tiny hands kept pointing frantically toward the window, down toward the gas station below. His tear-filled eyes locked with mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was as if I could feel his fear, his panic, his desperation to communicate something important, something I couldn't fully grasp. Then I woke up. It was October 31st, Halloween. The early morning light barely pierced through the heavy clouds, making the day feel even more eerie. My heart was pounding, my skin clammy with sweat. The boy's face still haunted me, his tearful voice echoing in my mind. I rushed to tell my parents about the dream. I expected them to take me seriously, to understand how real it had felt. But my dad just brushed it off. "It's just a nightmare," he said, with a wave of his hand. "Get a grip. You're letting your imagination run wild." But I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake the anxiety building in the pit of my stomach. All day I found myself staring out the window, my eyes glued to the buses that stopped at the gas station. Every time one pulled in, I tensed up, convinced it was about to crash into the station or explode. Nothing happened, but the fear gnawed at me, relentless. That evening, to calm my nerves, my siblings and I decided to head down to the gas station for snacks. We were planning a horror movie marathon, and I figured maybe a good scare on screen would drown out the fear bubbling inside me. As we walked into the brightly lit station, something caught my eye. A newspaper headline. The bold black letters screamed, "Bus accident in Tenerife." My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the paper, my hands trembling. The front page showed a bus, mangled and overturned, in front of a Shell gas station. It wasn't our station, but that wasn't the part that made my blood run cold. The bus had been carrying Swedish tourists. 28 people had been on board when it veered off the road near the airport. A Norwegian tourist leader had died in the crash. But what truly stopped me in my tracks was the photo beneath the headline. A picture of two young boys, their faces twisted in grief, crying in the aftermath of the accident. One of them, blonde-haired and wide-eyed with shock, was wearing a striped t-shirt. A t-shirt with a silver star printed in the middle of his chest. My legs went weak. It was him, the boy from my dream. He had survived the crash. I stared at the paper, my mind reeling. How could this be possible? How could a boy, a complete stranger, have appeared in my dream, warning me of an accident that happened thousands of miles away in Tenerife, around the same time I dreamt about it? My brain scrambled for logic, for an explanation, but there was none. My skepticism about the paranormal had always been ironclad. I didn't believe in psychics, mediums, or ghosts. Hell, I didn't even believe in the possibility of fate. But this shook me to my core. I bought the newspaper, and I've kept it ever since. A chilling reminder that some things just can't be explained. It haunts me still, the image of that little boy crying, the way he pointed toward the gas station, as if he knew what was happening, as if he was trying to reach out from the very fabric of reality to warn me. I haven't had a dream like that since, but to this day I wonder, was it a coincidence? Or was there something more at play, something darker and far beyond my understanding? And why me? Why did that boy choose me to witness his terror from across the sea as it unfolded? I'll probably never know, but whenever I think about it, a cold shiver crawls up my spine, and I'm reminded that sometimes the world is far stranger and far scarier than we could ever imagine.
My dad passed away when I was 15. The pain of losing him never truly went away, but over time, I learned to live with the ache, that hollow feeling left behind. Yet, despite the absence, there have been moments when I've felt his presence. Moments so inexplicable, so strange, that it felt like he was still watching over us, protecting us from the other side. I'm not one to dive into ghost stories or paranormal experiences, but some things simply can't be explained. One of the most chilling and profound moments happened when my niece was still a toddler. It was one of those quiet evenings where everything seemed peaceful. She was upstairs, tucked in for the night, her soft, rhythmic breathing filling the room. My sister and I were downstairs, completely lost in the flickering glow of the television. We were engrossed in a show, laughing, talking, not a care in the world. Everything felt normal, safe. But little did we know, as we sat on that couch, unaware, something terrifying was happening upstairs. My niece, who had seemed perfectly fine when we laid her down to sleep, was silently choking on her own vomit. Her tiny body, fragile and innocent, was in distress, and we had no idea. The TV drowned out any sounds, her small cries and gasps for help lost in the noise. Then, suddenly, it happened. A crash, loud, sharp, and jarring. The sound echoed through the house, cutting through the calm like a knife. My heart jumped into my throat as I whipped around to see what had caused the noise. There, lying shattered on the staircase, was a framed picture of my dad as a baby. The glass was everywhere, scattered across the wooden steps, reflecting the dim light from the hallway. The picture had been hanging there for years, perfectly secure, undisturbed. There was no draft, no vibration, nothing that could have caused it to fall. It didn't make any sense. My sister and I exchanged a look, confusion mingling with a sudden, gut-wrenching fear. We bolted up the stairs to clean up the glass, our minds still reeling from the strange occurrence. But as we reached the top of the stairs, something stopped us dead in our tracks. A sound, soft but unmistakable, came from my niece's room. The sound of distress, of struggle. We rushed toward her room, our hearts pounding. And that's when we found her. She was pale, her little face flushed with panic, struggling to breathe as she choked on her vomit. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear. In that moment, time seemed to freeze, and my sister and I snapped into action. We managed to get her upright, clearing her airway, and within moments, she was okay, though shaken and scared. It wasn't until later, when the adrenaline had worn off and we sat there, holding her close, that the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The picture, my dad's picture, it had fallen at the exact moment my niece needed help, shattering for the first time in all the years it had hung there, as if something, or someone, had been trying to get our attention. I couldn't help but feel a chill wash over me. Could it have been my dad? Was he watching over us, protecting his granddaughter from the beyond? The thought seemed far-fetched, but then again, how else could we explain it? We hadn't heard my niece. If not for that picture crashing down, who knows what might have happened? This wasn't the first time something like this had happened either. Over the years, there have been small signs, little coincidences that seem to defy logic. Moments where we felt his presence, like a protective force lingering just out of sight. It's hard to explain, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand it. But that night, as I sat with my niece safe in my arms, the memory of my dad's picture still fresh in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been him, his spirit reaching out, breaking through the barrier between life and death to make sure we heard his message. I'm not sure if I believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but I do believe in love that transcends even the deepest divides, and maybe, just maybe, my dad's love was strong enough to reach us from wherever he is now.
This didn't happen to me, but to my cousin. We were both extremely close to our grandmother, and after she passed away, the grief hung over us like a heavy fog. My cousin, in particular, felt the weight of her absence in everything she did. The year after my grandmother's passing, though, things started to get strange. A little too strange to ignore. It was as if, even in death, our grandmother wasn't quite ready to leave us completely. One of the most unsettling things happened just a couple of weeks after the funeral. My cousin had been having a rough day, one of those days where the sadness just wouldn't let go. She was missing our grandmother deeply, the loneliness creeping in with every quiet moment. Feeling a bit down, she wandered into the kitchen, hoping some food might distract her from the sadness that seemed to cling to the air like a thick cloud. She opened the fridge and spotted a 4-pack of kiwis she had bought earlier in the week. Our grandmother had been allergic to kiwis, but my cousin loved them, and for whatever reason, she decided to grab 2 from the pack. She peeled and ate them slowly, the tangy sweetness of the fruit doing little to lift her spirits. It was just another reminder of how much things had changed without our grandmother around. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, the sadness dulling, but never really leaving her. The next morning, my cousin returned to the fridge for breakfast. As she reached for something to eat, she glanced down at the kiwi pack. She froze, her hand hovering in the cold air. The package, still open from yesterday, was sitting there on the shelf, but instead of 2 kiwis left as there should have been, there were 4. 4 kiwis, as if she had never touched them. She stared at the fruit for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of it. The pack had clearly been opened, but somehow the kiwis had multiplied. Her mind raced. There was no one else in the house. She lived alone and no one had come over. There were no pets, no chance of a trick being played. It was just her and the kiwis that shouldn't have been there. She closed the fridge door, a shiver running down her spine. Could it have been our grandmother? She didn't know what to believe. It was such a small thing, just a pack of fruit, but it felt deliberate. It was almost like a message, a subtle, quiet reminder that our grandmother was still around, still keeping an eye on her. After all, kiwis were something she couldn't even be near without getting sick. Maybe this was her way of making her presence known, of showing she was still connected to the little moments in our lives, even from beyond. But that wasn't the last time something like this happened. Around the 1-year anniversary of our grandmother's passing, my cousin found herself talking to her more often, speaking into the empty rooms of her apartment, hoping that somehow our grandmother could hear her. One morning, before heading off to work, she stood in her quiet living room and spoke aloud. She told our grandmother that she missed her, that things weren't the same without her, and that she wished she could still feel her presence. The words were simple but heartfelt. The kind of conversation you have when you're grasping for any kind of connection with someone you've lost. That evening, when she came home, the apartment felt different. There was a stillness, but not the kind that felt lonely. It was warm, almost comforting. As she walked through her living room, her eyes caught something unusual on the floor. It was a birthday card, her grandmother's handwriting unmistakable on the front. Her heart skipped a beat as she bent down to pick it up, memories flooding back. The card had been safely tucked away, deep inside an old book on a shelf, stored away months ago. My cousin hadn't touched it in ages, and there was no reason for it to be on the floor. She lived alone. There were no pets, no one who could have knocked it loose. And the book? It was still neatly in place on the shelf, undisturbed. She opened the card, her eyes scanning the familiar words, and in that moment, it was like our grandmother was speaking to her all over again. It wasn't some grand supernatural event, but it felt personal, intimate, as if our grandmother had heard her that morning and wanted to give her a little something in return. A reminder that she was still there, still watching over her, still a part of her life even though she was gone. It was a small, quiet moment, but one that meant everything to my cousin. To this day, she holds on to that card, and whenever she thinks about our grandmother, she's reminded of those little signs, those strange, almost impossible moments that make you wonder if the people we love really ever leave us. Maybe, just maybe, they stay closer than we think, finding ways to reach out when we need them most.
About a month ago, in the chilly June weather, I decided to take a much-needed break from my usual job as a traffic controller. My best friend, Heather, was more than willing to tag along. Now, before you start wondering, Heather and I have always had a platonic relationship. She's like the big sister I never had. We've known each other since I was 17, nearly 40 years now, and we've been through thick and thin together. Heather also has this adorable little mini foxy dog named Pippa, and we go on these little adventures together whenever we get the chance. You might recognize Pippa if you've ever been to the old church in the woods. She's quite the character. Anyway, Heather and I decided to take a road trip. A proper getaway. We packed up the car, loaded Pippa in the back, and set out for the border ranges, with Tenterfield as our destination. For those who don't know, Tenterfield is where Peter Allen is from. You know, the guy who sang I Go to Rio? Yeah, him. The drive was about 6.5 hours, though a few stops by traffic controllers, some of whom I knew from work, slowed us down a bit. It wasn't until an hour later than expected that we finally rolled into town. We stayed the night at a cozy little pub. Nothing fancy, but it had that small town charm that's hard to find these days. We were both exhausted and ready for bed, eager to set out again the next morning. Late the following morning, after a decent breakfast, we stumbled upon this old cemetery. It wasn't marked on any maps, and from the looks of it, hadn't been tended to in years. The place had a haunting beauty to it, overrun with creeping ivy, lantana, and lichen, the kind of place that time forgot. It was tucked away off a dusty dirt road, surrounded by regenerating forest. Yet it was so close to the beaten path that I couldn't help but wonder why it had been left to decay like that. We wandered in, curiosity pulling us deeper into the overgrown graveyard. Many of the headstones were so weather-worn that the names were completely erased. Some dated as far back as the early 19th century, and the elements had taken their toll on them. Pippa, on the other hand, was loving every second of it, darting around, sniffing out new scents, wagging her little tail in excitement. As we ventured further in, we came across what appeared to be a children's section. The headstones were smaller, simpler, many of them only marked with a name or a year. A lot of the dates indicated that the children had been stillborn, which made the sight all the more heart-wrenching. It was around then that I felt it, of a tug on my jacket. It wasn't a soft breeze or the brush of a branch. It felt deliberate, like a small hand anxiously trying to get my attention. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just spooked by the eerie atmosphere. But as we walked further, it happened again. A sharp, insistent tug. I turned quickly, but again, there was no one there. No wind strong enough to move my coat, no one around us. Just silence, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves. Heather noticed something was off and called out to me. "You all right over there?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "I don't know," I started to say. But then my eyes landed on Pippa, and that's when things got really weird. She was on her back, wriggling around, tail wagging furiously, as though someone was rubbing her belly, but there was no one there. Heather, what the hell is Pippa doing?" Heather turned to look and saw the same thing I did. Pippa, normally calm and quiet, was acting like she was playing with someone, wagging her tail like mad, yapping in excitement, something she rarely does. She glanced at us, then looked around, as if searching for whoever had just been playing with her. But there was no one, just us. I had an idea. More like an experiment, really, to see if Pippa could sense something that we couldn't. I'm not a ghost hunter. Never wanted to be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. Heather wasn't too keen on the idea at first. "No way in hell are you using Pippa for some weird ghost experiment," she protested, arms crossed. "I'm not letting you drag her into this." But after a bit of convincing and the realization that we'd have to walk back through the cemetery anyway, she agreed to see what would happen. Pippa led the way, trotting along the overgrown path, past cracked and broken headstones. Her nose stayed to the ground, but every now and then she would stop and look around, as if following some unseen guide. Then she stopped in front of a small headstone. She sat down, tail wagging softly. Heather knelt down and brushed some of the dirt off the stone. "I think it says Amelia," she murmured. She was 7 years old, died in 1867. She looked up at me, her eyes misty. Such a short life. But why Pippa? I shrugged, unsure of what to say. Maybe Amelia had a dog once. Maybe she used to rub its belly and Pippa just reminded her of it. Heather stood up and went off to find some flowers, returning with a handful of Banksias. She laid them gently on Amelia's grave, a small token of respect for the child we'd never know. I took Pippa's collar off for a moment and placed it on the headstone, a quiet offering. As we walked back to the car, the chill in the air felt a little less biting. Maybe, just maybe, not all spirits are here to harm us. Some, like little Amelia, just want to play one last time.
When I was about 6 or 7, something happened that I still can't fully wrap my head around to this day. We were visiting Ireland, like we usually did, being half Irish. Whenever we went, we stayed in the countryside. Fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and the roads were barely lit with streetlights. That trip started just like all the others, picking up groceries, visiting family, going to Mass. The place we stayed was this old cottage. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror film. Wooden interiors, creaky floors, and an old-school coal fire that added to its eerie vibe. It was a typical, spooky-looking house. I was sleeping in the guest room by myself, which, let's be honest, was spooky enough on its own. Every time I was in there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, like someone, or something, was watching me. One particular day, I wasn't feeling too well, so I stayed in and played with my action figures at the top of the stairs. Now, these stairs weren't your average straight stairs. They were swirly, winding down in that way that already gave you the creeps if you stared too long. As I was playing, I suddenly heard my mom calling me from downstairs. Or at least I thought it was her. I called back but got no response. Thinking she didn't hear me, I looked down the stairs and shouted again, asking what she wanted. Still, nothing. The silence was unnerving, but what really chilled me was when I turned back around and saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't just any figure, though. It looked like a cowboy. I remember being frozen in total shock, unable to move or even process what I was seeing. There he stood, this cowboy-type figure, just staring back at me from the end of the hall. I still don't know what to make of it. Panicked, I bolted down the stairs, only to find both my parents fast asleep on the sofa. That made everything even scarier, because I was absolutely certain I'd heard my mom calling my name. When I woke them up to tell them what had happened, they said I looked pale as a ghost. From that point on, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the guest room anymore. I ended up crashing on the floor in my parents' room for the rest of the trip. To this day, it's the first and only time I've ever experienced something like that. And it still leaves me wondering what, or who, that cowboy figure was.
A couple of days ago, I went camping in Hokkaido. Down there, in places like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, the temperatures were unbearable, but I'd made my escape. My destination was Gifu, known for its stunning Hida Takayama region. The place is steeped in natural beauty, with its mountainous landscape and cool rivers running through it. I was heading to a quiet campsite, nestled near a river that ran alongside an ancient cherry tree. As I arrived, my old friend Brian was there waiting for me. His face lit up when he saw me, and he pulled me into a bear hug. We caught up, reminiscing about old times back when we both lived in Nagoya. Brian, an Aussie in his 30s now, was the one who had introduced me to the joys of camping. Back when we met, he was a young man of 24, but time had flown by. Still, his love for adventure hadn't waned. We made our way to our campsite, a picturesque spot near the river, beneath that grand old cherry tree. In April, Brian told me, the riverbanks would be carpeted in cherry blossom petals. It was a sight I had to see for myself one day. We pitched our tents, got the stove going, and settled in for a peaceful time, feeling far from the worries of the world. The campsite's keeper came by, giving us a thumbs up for our setup. "Well done," he said cheerfully, before pointing to the sky. "Rain's coming. Stay away from the river when it hits." We looked up and saw a few ominous clouds gathering in the distance. It didn't seem like much at first, but nature has a way of turning on you fast, and turn it did. By late afternoon, the skies opened up. The rain came down hard, much harder than we expected. We had to scramble to pack up and move to higher ground, closer to a log house that was nearby. As we hurried, I saw something that stopped me cold. In the dim light, standing right in the middle of the rushing river, I could make out the silhouette of a child. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. "Hey, Roy!" Brian's voice was sharp, startling me out of my daze. He patted my shoulder urgently. "Do you see that kid out there?" I turned to him, feeling a chill run down my spine. "You see it too? My eyesight's not great, but it looks so blurry." Brian's face grew serious. "We shouldn't talk about it." Something in his tone froze me in place. Brian had never been one for spooky tales or ghost stories, but there was something unsettling about the way he said that. He was gifted, or at least that's what people said. His mother, a renowned Indian fortune teller, had passed down certain sensitivities to him. Ever since her death, he had started seeing and hearing things other people couldn't. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I had to do something. What if that child was real, stranded in the middle of a dangerous rising river? I ran out of the tent and flagged down the campsite keeper. Breathlessly, I told him about the child. He didn't seem too alarmed, but got into his van and drove down towards the riverbank to investigate. Brian didn't move. He stood there, frozen, staring into the rain-soaked distance, his body rigid as if paralyzed. I called out to him, "Brian, where did the child go?" But he didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge me. My heart raced as I looked back towards the river. There was no one there, no child, no figure, just the roaring current, swollen from the rain. The keeper's van disappeared further down the riverbank, his shouts echoing through the storm, but they went unanswered. I hurried back to Brian, desperate for some explanation, anything to make sense of what I'd just seen. Brian finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The child was in the tent with me, Roy, standing right here. But it's gone now, the moment you came back." I felt an icy grip around my heart. What the hell had just happened? There had been no footsteps, no sign of anything moving in or out of the tent. And yet, Brian had seen the child inside with him, even when I was sure I had seen it in the river. We packed up and left as soon as the rain let up, the atmosphere between us tense and thick with unspoken fear. Neither of us mentioned the child again, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind, the blurry figure standing in the river and Brian's haunting words. As we drove away, the river receding into the distance, I couldn't help but feel like something, or someone, was watching us leave. Not all things that linger in this world are seen by everyone. Some are only felt in the pit of your stomach or in the sudden weight of an old friend's words. I don't know what we saw that day, but it felt ancient,